Welcome to episode 359 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Katherine Schweit, who served in the FBI for 20 years. In this episode, Katherine reviews Operation United, the largest coordinated exhumation of unidentified murder victims in FBI history. The initiative was spearheaded by Detroit Police Detective Shannon Jones and FBI Special Agent Leslie Larson. Their primary goal: to identify the nameless dead and bring closure to families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. Their ultimate goal: solve more than 200 murder cases. Shannon and Leslie assembled a team led by female forensic anthropologists, scientists, and investigators who methodically unearthed Detroit's painful past. Katherine Schweit is the author of Women Who Talk to the Dead, the true story of 200 forgotten murder victims and the relentless pursuit of justice by an FBI agent and a Detroit police detective. Part forensic procedural, part social justice narrative, this book exposes the tragic consequences when the criminal justice system fails those most vulnerable. It also celebrates the resilience and the determination of the law enforcement officers who refused to let these unforgotten victims remain nameless. Katherine's first assignment was to the FBI's Milwaukee division, where she worked national security matters. Following her time in Milwaukee, Katherine was promoted to FBI headquarters and assigned to the Counterintelligence Division's training center at Quantico, working at a joint FBI-CIA facility at an undisclosed location. She then joined the new National Security Branch executive staff and was promoted to unit chief in the Human Resource Division, developing a system to train and organize agents based on their skill sets. She moved to the FBI's Washington field office to create a media and outreach program before returning to FBI headquarters. Her last assignment was as a senior executive, guiding the formation of the FBI's Active Shooter Initiative. After retiring from the Bureau, Katherine opened her own consulting business, Schweit Consulting, LLC, providing consulting services to businesses, schools, and others focused on improving security policies, procedures, and training. She is the author of several books and the host of the Stop the Killing podcast. To learn more, visit her website at katherineschweit.com. This episode is dedicated to Special Agent Leslie Larson, Senior Team Leader of the Detroit FBI's Evidence Response Team, ERT, and her partner, Detroit Police Detective Shannon Jones. Leslie, I know you are a loyal listener of the podcast. I do this show for you and all the active FBI employees out there on the job. Remember, no matter what, we've got your backs. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee, join my reader team about crime fiction and the FBI and books, TV, and movies, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Katherine Schweit. Hey, Katherine, how are you?
Hi, Jerry. I'm so excited to be back on the show. I loved hanging out with you.
Yeah, you've been on twice before. Episode 255, when we talked about school shootings and the FBI's active shooter program. And then you were back with your co-host from the Stop the Killing podcast, Sarah Ferris, and we talked about understanding deadly force. So welcome back.
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited because I haven't talked to you in a while. We've been running around the country, writing books and releasing books and talking on podcasts, and we never seem to be in the same town at the same time. That's got to be our next goal.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we talked about CrimeCon. I'm not going this year, but definitely next year. Hopefully, we can both be at CrimeCon. That's going to be my goal for 2026 because it will be my 10-year anniversary podcasting.
I can't believe it. That's amazing.
I can't either.
Congratulations. That's so exciting.
Thank you. All right, but today we are here to talk about Operation United, which you have recounted for us in a beautiful book called Women Who Talk to the Dead. Wow, what a title.
Yeah, the title just kind of screamed out to me when I was working on this book, so I can certainly kind of fill you in. You know, you get a title like that, then you have to run a subtitle. The subtitle on the book is The True Story of 200 Forgotten Murder Victims and the Relentless Pursuit of Justice by an FBI Agent and a Detroit Police Detective. So a little more detail.
Yeah, and definitely something that still makes you say, "What?" and have this desire to learn more. So we're going to learn more today about Operation United and the women that you profile in your book. So I guess the logical question, anybody who ever talks to an author, the logical question is, why did you write this book?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes in the production of it, I kept thinking to myself, why am I writing this book? But I have a real answer to that. There are two main people in the book. I would say characters, but it's a nonfiction book. It's a true story. Two law enforcement officers, one from the Detroit Police Department and one from the FBI. And the FBI person is a special agent, Leslie Larson. Leslie and I met when she joined the FBI, when she was just a kid. Now she runs one of the largest forensics teams that the FBI has. But when she joined the FBI, she was still finishing her master's degree, and she was a kid in Wisconsin, a farm kid from Wisconsin. She joined and really was hired to put mail in the mail slots every day and take out confidential trash and spot somebody when somebody needed to go, take a 10-minute break from the radio room. So she was just like the bottom of the rung when it came to, hey, somebody needs something to do, get Leslie to move all these boxes kind of thing. At the time, I was the terrorism supervisor in Milwaukee, and it was an opportunity to kind of guide her a little bit. And through the years, she would call me all the time, and she refers to me. I don't think it's a secret to say she refers to me as her mentor. And she called me all the time about, should I take this promotion? When should I apply to be an agent? Because she worked her way through the ranks from just a person doing basic stuff through analyst jobs and forensics expertise and dealing with confidential sources and just the whole gamut of what you do in the FBI, including an intelligence analyst for 5 years, and then became an agent. And all the time she was like, should I do this? What do you think about that? And she would call me if she got stuck on a case or she was frustrated about something. Management, how should I talk to managers about this? So one day she called me, and this, I have to say, this has to go back 7, 8 years. And she called me because she was she was running this forensics team in Detroit for the FBI. Detroit is responsible for the state of Michigan. And she was trying to work with local police on this project. And she said she really needed some funding from headquarters to travel some people. We call it travel, right? To travel some people, to have some employees from our other offices have expertise in some areas to come to Detroit to work. And she'd managed to accomplish it like 1 year, but then the next year she was having trouble, and she would always call and say, I can't get anybody at headquarters on the phone. And, who do you think I should talk to about this? And how should I write that? And should I write an EC, electronic communication, a request to headquarters? So it was constantly these conversations. This one day she called and said she couldn't accomplish this, and she was trying to do this thing. And she told me what this thing was. And this thing was Operation United, which stands for unknown names identified through exhumations and DNA. That's where the name comes from. Operation United is an effort that the FBI and the Detroit Police Department chose to do that involves digging up unidentified murder victims that are buried in paupers' graves. They're unidentified. They were buried without a name. So they would pull the DNA from them, the bodies, and try to get an identification so they could solve the murder. It's very hard to solve a murder if you don't know who the murder victim is. So first I was like, what are you doing? And she's like, yeah, we've got this plan and we're going to do this. And, we're kind of working on it, but I'm really stuck. I need some funding for this. And I said, well, tell me more about this plan. I said, how many people are you digging up? And, Jerry, we've all heard stories about taking DNA from somebody's grave to verify it's somebody who's and identify a murder victim or maybe solve a murder, reconnect family members together, right?
Right.
So you work in this business. We work in this business. We hear in true crime stories all the time. There's a special episode or a podcast about a person who was identified after their DNA was taken after they were dug up. So I said, well, how many bodies do you think you need to dig up? And she said, we're thinking about 200. And I said, what? She said, yeah, we're thinking about 200. I said, you're going to dig 200 bodies up? And she said, well, at least. And they're all murder victims. So that's the way that we can try to solve their murders. She said, it's also, we want to reconnect them with family members. So that's kind of where it started. Probably should have said at the very beginning that this is the largest exhumation of murder victims the FBI has ever done in its 100+ year history.
I guess the question is, why does Detroit at this time, as they're beginning this project, why are there 200 unidentified murder victims? I mean, how does that happen? I mean, I'm thinking at least, when a dead body is found, that the least that is done is to identify who that person is. We may not be able to solve the murder, but before they're put in the ground, we try to find out who they are.
Yeah, one would like to think that's true, but it's not. And it's not only not in Detroit, it's not, as I learned, historically, it's not throughout the United States. There are a lot of times when, maybe the best example is that Detroit police had a form. And again, this is not just Detroit. And the reason Detroit struck a chord with me is Leslie is assigned to Detroit, but Detroit is my hometown. And so this was an important story for me to tell personally. These 200 murder victims, they date back some 70 years. These are cold case murders that have been sitting on the shelves in paper files. And that's really part of what I wanted to bring out in the book, is to help readers not only be entertained and hear an interesting story like you would want anybody who's reading a book, but also to kind of give them that knowledge base about what the challenges are in police work and kind of what has been and hasn't been done through the years. The example I was thinking of is Detroit police at the time had a form that the detectives who arrived on the scene of a murder would fill out, and it had kind of 5 check boxes on it. And it says, one of them is like, is there a suspect? Are there leads to follow up? And the cases would be, you fish a body out of the river, or you find a burned out body or a broken, cut apart body in an abandoned building. If they don't know who it is, the police report would oftentimes be 1 page long, and there's not really any leads to follow. What are the leads to follow? You knock on the doors. I mean, that as an agent, we've done that. You do a knock and talk. You knock on the neighbors' doors. They say, I don't know who that is. If they fish somebody out of a river or Lake St. Clair, how do they know who that is? How do they know where to go to knock and find family members? Nobody drops a dead body in their next door neighbor's house. These are bodies that people are often killed, and then they're transported someplace. And there are very few leads. And 70 years goes back to the days when nobody had Ring cameras. Nobody had cameras in front of their houses. And there wasn't any opportunity to pick up a license plate when somebody drove through an intersection or things like that. So these were just closed. These cases were just left. I don't want to say closed. They were just left as cold cases. And I thought maybe this was unusual until we expanded beyond Detroit. And in fact, Operation United worked all the cases in Wayne County, which is a much bigger area than the city of Detroit. And all around the country, I discovered that this is very common. There are paupers' graves, including cold case murders, that are unsolved. And for a host of reasons, law enforcement, manpower, no, don't go after the low hanging fruit. But I think the other thing that struck me was I really felt working this case. I've been working this story for, nearly a decade. And I feel like the saddest part about it is that the way that we're willing to discard somebody who isn't important enough to look for, maybe they come from a marginalized community, or maybe they're not wealthy, or maybe they're an immigrant, or they're a person of color, maybe they're a teenager who ran away from home. And so I think the files kind of read like there was some level of, nobody's clamoring to find out who that person is, who was 20-some-year-old Black girl found on, Woodward Avenue. And there doesn't seem to be a missing person file on her. So let's just walk away from this case and handle a case that's more important, where somebody is knocking on our door because their teenage cheerleader daughter is missing.
Wow, that that really makes the point, because again, if we don't even know who this person is, there is absolutely no chance that they're going to find some type of justice against a person who took their life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why I really wanted to tell this story. I feel like it's a really beautiful story about a FBI agent and a Detroit police detective, who took on this impossible challenge that nobody else in law enforcement had tried over 70 years. Their courage and their tenacity. And the reason that the book is called Women Who Talk to the Dead is because when I started to do the interviews for this book, which took me a long time, they went out to the cemeteries for 5 years in a row. And I went out to the cemeteries with them. And when I started to talk to them about this, I'd say, who else do I need to talk to understand what you're doing? And they'd say, oh, talk to so-and-so. And then they'd say, oh, talk to so-and-so. And oh, talk to so-and-so. Everybody was female. So eventually I was working with forensic anthropologists too, which is part of who you need in order to pull bones. And I said, well, why are all the people who are leading this case a female? Like, why are the female prosecutor, female FBI agent, female Detroit detective, five female forensic anthropologists, and on and on and on.
Did you find the answer to that? Because that is so curious.
I had a long number of conversations. You know how we are in the police world. We just kind of go, well, we do the job. And so I think that Leslie Larson from the FBI and Detective Shannon Jones from the DPD, they kind of took it in stride. But I think when you hear how they describe it and what they're thinking, they recognize that they don't take no for an answer, that women just do things, and they concede that, women have a kind of a sixth sense about things that sometimes they're willing to listen to, I think is a better way to put it, when maybe some of their male counterparts just don't listen for that sixth sense. One of the forensic anthropologists who I spoke to and I talked to about, I have her detailed in the book also. Her name is Jody Barda, and she was teaching at Madonna. She was running the forensics team program at Madonna University outside of Detroit in Livonia at the time. And she said women just have this need to nurture and care and find answers in a way, and they are so much more focused on it. And of course, as you can imagine, as a writer, she said it much more eloquently. So if you want to know what she really said, check it out in the book. But she recognizes that women, they carry it a different way. They look in different corners.
And I guess we could compare this and relate this to the fact that the true crime community is primarily women who listen to true crime podcasts, who follow true crime stories on TV, and, read the books. It's always been fascinating. And people have always brought the fact up that women gravitate to there's no other way to describe it, but morbid stories of death and murder.
I've heard that too, that women make up about 80% of the true crime audience. And whether it's books or podcasts and other writings, TV shows and things like that, I think that women have a nurturing sense of justice. I know this is a big category, and I don't mean to say men are not like this. And in fact, if you read my book, the idea of what men and women are, and Jody Barda did talk about this false concept of men and women only, and how genetically we're really quite different than that, and that's what the science tells us. But just the way that culturally women are brought up to be nurturers, but also to solve, but also in much more fear. And the women who are listening to this know I was out for a hike yesterday at Manassas National Battlefield, which is the closest park to my house. I was out by myself on a 5-mile hike and had 2 rocks, in my hands, one in my left and one in my right, and walked and hiked the whole time looking over my shoulder because I was alone. Women do that. Men would never even think they had to look over their shoulders or look in front of them.
Right. And women know they have to. Got to be ready.
Mm-hmm. Women know they have to. Yeah. And I know it may seem to somebody who's never lived with that constant fear, that constant thing, that may seem over the top, but it isn't to women. And we don't live with it every day thinking about it all the time. But a woman who doesn't think about it, is fooling herself. You do have to be cautious and careful. And so I think how that translates into the true crime genre is that women want to solve the crimes. They want to see justice.
All right, we do need to clarify that we're talking about these unsolved cold cases that are sitting around because the truth is the majority of investigators and law enforcement personnel are men. So we don't want anyone to think that we're saying that men don't care about solving crimes. That's absolutely not what we're saying. We're talking about these cold cases that remain unsolved. And for some reason, women have gravitated to trying to solve those mysteries.
Yeah, and let me put a little context in it when it comes to the book. Operation United did stretch back over 70 years. And if you go back to the time when I was a kid, which was not 70 years ago, but if you go back through these time periods, at one point, Detroit was known as the murder capital of the world. And the unsolved crimes were, sometimes there just wasn't manpower to actually work these cases. I think that's the reality of a city that had lowered revenues, eventually filed for bankruptcy. Law enforcement, it's not like law enforcement's not working. It's that they're going to go to the low-hanging fruit and work the cases they can. And they had 3 times as many murders, back in the 70s as they do now. So the cases that they didn't have any leads on, law enforcement, understandably, that folder is going to sit on your desk longer because there's nothing for you to chase. And that's the value of being able to exhume the body, get some DNA, see what else might have been in the file, what else might have been in the casket if it's still there, that might today, to an investigator who has more time, like Shannon Jones, who doesn't have more time but is making the time. She's devoted the rest of her career to this effort. Those investigations are being able to tie people together through DNA, gives them so many more leads and so many more opportunities. This is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process, and they're identifying people. They're working through these cases. And just as an example, one of the individuals who's not detailed in my book, but I know that is doing interviews now, she was not even born when her dad disappeared, and he was murdered. She had no idea. She grew up. This is not an unusual story in these situations. Shannon Jones knocks on her door and says, I want to tell you, I have your father identified as a murder victim. She'd been raised by a stepfather. And for a child who spends her entire life wondering where her dad went, to change that world, this was Shannon's and Leslie's priority. And that's what they've done. And that's what they're doing. It's an incredible story.
So these 200 bodies that they're going to dig up and try to identify go all the way back to the 1970s?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. They go back to the late 50s.
Wow.
So 70 years. The reason they go back that far is because Shannon had access to the paper files in their warehouse and the missing persons and cold case murders. Here's the tie-in. And here's what makes this incredible and what makes this a story that is now going to be duplicated across the country. Shannon Jones' efforts have changed the way law enforcement in Detroit and in Michigan forever handle missing person cases and cold case murders, because those have generally been handled by 2 separate sections in law enforcement. Somebody handles missing persons and the detectives handle murders. Shannon said, no, those could be one and the same. And she began connecting these groups together. She literally started tacking files up on her wall, one file after another on the wall in her office, with a sign over it that said, who am I? Those were her cold case murders. And then file after file after file on the right that said, where am I? Those were her missing persons. And because she did that, she began to see that sometimes she had a person on the left that matched a person on the right.
And that is so heartwarming because we were just talking about these murder victims that nobody cared about, that just were buried. But what you're saying is, no, there were many situations where there were family members and loved ones who didn't know they were murdered, didn't know they were dead. They just knew that they were missing and they wanted to
Exactly.
find them. Wow.
Exactly. You could see why I needed to tell this story. I really want the public to understand what incredible work it took to do this, what incredible work it takes to continue to do this by this tremendous number of people. Because, there's always a lot of criticism about law enforcement. They're an easy target. I get it. I was in law enforcement for 20 years as an FBI agent. Before that, a prosecutor in Chicago. It's always easy to blame law enforcement. But, these law enforcement officers and agents, when the whole world gave up on these murder victims, Leslie and Shannon never did.
Let's go back to Leslie a little bit because in the book, you talk about the fact that even as a young kid in high school, she knew that she wanted to do something like this. I mean, her mind took her places that most young girls' minds didn't go. She knew she wanted to be either an anthropologist or she knew that she wanted to dig up bodies.
Yeah. She had grown up on the farm, and I did want to share with the readers a little bit about their backgrounds of some of these women and really what motivates them to do what they do today. Because I feel like sometimes we don't get the backstory on people, and especially for Leslie as an agent, she thrives on backstories. As a kid, she dug up on stuff on her family farm. She used to go to the mall with her mom, and she'd sit on a bench and watch people walk by, and she'd make up stories about them or ask herself, why is this guy's blue jeans worn the way they're worn in the knees? I mean, she was always thriving on filling in the backstory about people. And I think that curiosity is what makes an incredible FBI agent, certainly law enforcement officer, but that curiosity not only to, solve cases per se, but to get answers about who is who. Because in this case, even for Operation United, the women agreed that their first priority was to reconnect family members. That's part of why Leslie really wanted to do this. She's actually now a certified genetic genealogist so that she can do genetic genealogy research and testing to connect victims up in a way that, 10 years ago, we would have never even known you could do it. Because it's not just DNA, it's much more sophisticated than that. But Leslie really grew up with really fantastic parents. Her mom passed away in the last year of their digs season, which was sad because I know her parents really well. Used to spend time in their kitchen eating cookies that she made all the time, and she'd send cookies home for me and my kids. From the very early age, she wanted to do this and be an archaeologist, and then she saw Silence of the Lambs, and then she decided she needed to be an agent. So she'd made that determination in her teens, and she never altered from that.
And so when you were saying that she was working in a support non-agent position in the FBI, that sounds that that was a strategic move that she made. I understand that the first thing she did while she was in college was to apply and get accepted to the FBI's elite honors internship program.
Yes. And I think she was just kind of in the right place at the right time to be able to get one of those positions. They're very hard to get into, but I always encourage people who are interested, somebody who's a freshman in college or even a sophomore, they're like, say, well, I want to apply. The competition for the jobs are for these internships. They're paid internships for the summer, and they're fantastic positions, opportunities. And usually we only take juniors after your junior year, seniors, and master's students, PhD students, and those employees that come on, oftentimes, if they get accepted in an internship, they're offered a job. I had a great relationship with human resources when I worked there in FBI headquarters as an executive, and I would always take like at least a half a dozen of these honors interns every summer in whatever program I was working in. And many, many times they were female, and I would take them and kind of mentor through them. And some of them I'm still mentoring today in their careers because they went on to work in law enforcement or some other position that was related, law, things like that. Honors internship is great.
Yeah, and how unbelievable it was that of all the places in the FBI as an intern she could work, she was assigned to the behavioral analysis unit at the FBI Academy.
Oh, incredible. Incredible. Right.
I mean, you talk about somebody who was inspired by Silence of the Lambs, and now she's going to that unit.
Yeah, I think she was gobsmacked. She came to the FBI to work full time while she finished her master's program after she came back from the summer working with our behavioral experts in Quantico. And I think she was locked and loaded after that. The idea that somebody could draw that, I think her, essay that she wrote must have been quite compelling and said that that's what she was so interested in. But she definitely drew a very plum assignment. It's a rare occurrence to be able to get that kind of an assignment. And when the behavioral units, what people always refer to as profilers, when they were really kind of in their infancy, they were just starting to work on serial murders and things like that. Leslie was there at the table. She loved it. She loved it. I remember talking to her about it way back then.
So her career, once she did become an agent, I think that was her initial goal to become a profiler. But she started out even before she became an agent in that support capacity in the Milwaukee office. She joined the evidence response team. Can you talk about the role of non-agents on the evidence response team, which every FBI office has at least one team, if not a number of teams?
Yeah, the ERTs, as we call them, these teams include people who are trained to do kind of everything, just like agents are trained when they go through the academy at Quantico. Anybody who wants to be part of an evidence ERT is going to be trained to take fingerprints in different ways and footprints, but also, tire prints and collect evidence, properly pick up, shell casings and take blood samples from blood that might be on the scene, collect body parts if that's what needs to be done, and anything else that, pick up and safely secure a weapon, all the kinds of things that you need to do to put a crime scene back together in a courtroom, essentially, is what you want to do, right? As a prosecutor, I wanted to have all the evidence, and you only get one time to collect the evidence right, usually in one of these scenes. So the ERT team, and I know I worked out of our Washington field office for a while, and I think they had 5 teams at the time. Leslie's team in Detroit has 40 members right now. They collect everything. They have hazardous materials people on their team, and they have photographers. I think it's common that maybe people think, oh, agents do this. But in fact, ERT is what we call an ancillary duty, which means that anybody can join ERT as long as they get the training and there's a spot for them. And then you do it as as a duty outside of your regular duty assignment. So you might be the person who works as a photographer doing whatever photographers do at the FBI. But if you want to be the photographer for the evidence response team, then you get training in how to collect the right kind of photo evidence for a criminal trial or a national security trial. And then you're part of the team, and when you get called out, you stop what you're doing on a regular day and you go. ERTs are oftentimes analysts and other historically called support personnel, but professional staff who work in the office and who are looking for opportunities to try and learn other things and do other things. And for Leslie, that was essential to her. She wanted to be the best agent she could be, and she knew that working ERT would get her right into the cases in the field, even though she was hired to put mail in mailboxes. So it was a great opportunity for her. And it was really a tribute to her aggressiveness to say, I want to be part of solving crimes.
Yeah, so after she left Milwaukee and became an agent and was assigned to Detroit, she raised her hand again and volunteered to be a member of the Detroit ERT and eventually became the team leader.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's get back to Operation United because, again, this was something that was unique. Something like this had not happened in the FBI ever. So, how did this happen? I mean, did Leslie and Shannon know each other? Because Shannon has a problem. And it sounds like what she did was to go to Leslie to help her solve that problem. And as you've already stated, once Leslie decided she wanted to help, then it was a matter of trying to convince headquarters to make it happen, to fund it, to allow them to do this.
Yeah, I think that a couple of things that really struck me is Leslie had done an exhumation for the Michigan State Police of 2 bodies for cases they were working on. And Shannon attended that exhumation. And so she had an opportunity to see. Shannon is kind of stubbornly independent, and you can feel that when you read the book. And she didn't really necessarily look for other people to work with. So working the missing persons desk, what she took on was a sole person. She was the only one assigned to it.
Wait a minute. She's the only one assigned to it in the entire Detroit Police Department?
Yeah. So you can see how overwhelming it is, right? She's the only, and that's just one of her duties. She also responds to every time a police officer fires a gun, she has to go out to the field. So missing persons is hers alone. And then there's all these other duties that she has assigned to her also. So she was working aggressively on these cases, but not making progress. And she knew it. Because of that, she called Leslie. And actually, I think you have to hear their words. I mean, how she put it. Basically, she said, let's just dig these people up. And, for Leslie, the idea of digging people up is great. She's been trained at the body farm, and there's another body farm in the northern area of Michigan, northern Michigan, called Frost Center, which actually is just what it sounds like. We're a body farm where they also take bodies out of frozen ground. And now Leslie is so trained in this area that she is training people across the world in digging up bodies and preserving things and doing it right. When Shannon came to her with this challenge, Leslie is all about challenges. So she said, let's make a plan. Let's figure out how to do this. And between the two of them, Shannon said, I'll do everything above ground and you do everything below ground. And Leslie just figured it out. She put a plan together. She got the people together. She came up with an idea of how they could do this. And they started digging. And they didn't even know when they started if they could get funding for a second year or if they would need a second year. But as it turned out, they had a lot of challenges. Shut down a few times. It appeared they were going to just have to abandon the effort. But they overcame it in terms of the digging. They were able to spend the time to dig up these 200 plus bodies. Actually, it was more than 200, but it was 200 is what their goal was.
Okay, so we haven't really talked about the whole purpose of digging up these bodies. So once they dug them up, what were they hoping to get from these human remains?
So here's the fascinating thing about DNA. And I kind of tried to, explain the DNA aspect of it because I think we all know DNA. Oh, DNA, that matches a person to a person. We probably don't really know as much as we could know. So I tried to describe it in kind of simple terms I could understand, as they would say. And I had my assistance from my forensic anthropologist. Because once you have DNA, we have it forever. So DNA guarantees a connection to somebody else. So as everybody does their ancestry DNA and puts their information into this database or that database, even if you have somebody who's missing in your family, you can do a cheek swab, get that into a database. The DOJ has a database for missing persons, NamUs it's called. And there are these databases. Once the DNA is in there, it never goes away. The DNA profile doesn't go away. So what happens is they, for example, I mentioned that this young lady who wasn't even born when her father disappeared, well, her DNA still matches the dad. When they had the DNA for the dad and they found somebody in DNA databases with the name who met the criteria for matching, say if you had somebody and you matched 50% of your DNA to that person, that means that is either your sibling, right? 50% DNA match is your sibling or your mother or your father. So it's all generational. You get half of your DNA from your mom, half from your dad, but it's also grandparents. Like every step away is another quarter, right? Another half. So your grandparents, if you have 25% DNA, that's kids. That's your kids' kids, your grandparents, 2 generations away. So once they start getting DNA from somebody from one of these, they're able to see if there are people who are related. And because of that, many times it's kind of like a spider web. You might have Bill over here. You see that your unknown person is matched to Bill, but then you also have Sally over here. And Sally over here also matches your unknown person. When you match Bill and Sally's DNA profiles, you may find exactly who that person is because the DNA doesn't lie. And that's the genetic genealogy connections that Leslie is able to do now, certified to do. So they're able to find somebody who maybe you don't have the DNA for the person who died that was given that, like sometimes the DNA comes up and it is a person who's in the criminal database. That means the DNA came from the person who was put in the ground and nobody ever bothered or nobody had the ability at the time to match that person to the name.
And this is also called familial DNA?
Familial DNA connections, correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. If you and I are in commit a felony, and we're in today, we commit a felony, Jerry, and they take our DNA and they put it in a database. And then if something happens to us, the DNA comes back to us. They can pull a DNA sample, they look at DNA sample and they say, oh, that's Jerry Williams, or that's Kate Schweit's DNA. But in the case of so many of these victims, there isn't any direct connection to them, but there might be very close. What if somebody, as some of these cases have been, what if somebody who's in the ground was actually the brother of somebody who is currently in jail? Their DNA is going to match 50%. And that makes it pretty clear. If the person in jail has one brother, then the person in the ground is the brother. That's what they're able to do with familial DNA. So for Shannon, every ID they come up with, every DNA connection they come up with that connects them closer and closer to names, allows her to find a name and then take that name and go back to those people, back to those neighborhoods, back to the file, and see what was in the file that, if we had a name attached to it, would have made a lot more sense.
And this is so fascinating. I want to remind everyone that I did a 2-part episode with the FBI's leading team on investigative genetic genealogy. They're retired now, and they're have their own company where they're continuing their work on this. But I interviewed Steve Bush and Steve Kramer in episodes 306 and 307. So if you want to learn more about genetic genealogy and how it's used for cold cases, as a matter of fact, they work together and were the team that identified who the Golden State Killer was. Then, of course, investigators continued to find the evidence to prove that and charge him. But their work were the building blocks of that case because they were able to identify the former police officer as a Golden State Killer. So the work that's being done with familial DNA is absolutely amazing. And so that's what Operation United is all about, getting these bodies.
I'm glad you have the references to the longer episodes about it, because in the book I discuss genetic factors and explain to the readers about it. But the story is a broader story. It's not just a story about genetics, right? It's not just a story about cold case murders. It's really a story about what it takes in order to solve these kinds of crimes. What does it mean to dig bodies up? We know the word exhume, but what does it take to actually exhume a body? What is it like out at the cemetery to do that? And how important is it to do that? I think one of the things that I took away from this is, to these women, that the word no, just an opportunity to look for another way to get it done. I think it's very reflective a bit of how women have tackled problems historically and certainly today. Women have, as a group, women have infinite moxie in my mind. This book is going to resonate with mothers who get, up in the middle of the night every night because their 9-month-old child won't let anybody else comfort them. And they figure it out. Women who go to work, at the work, they have to step into the hallway to handle a call between fighting siblings, which we've all done. And to listen to, your kids, even when you're tired, you're listening to your kids because your kid broke up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend and they're sad and you want to go to bed, but your kid wants to talk. Women have this bottomless pit of empathy and sympathy, and that reflects in the way that they talk at the scene of these digs to each other and even to the bones while they are pulling them out of body bags. It was amazing. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to be there and to see how respectful they are, how they never give up, and how fortunate we are to have law enforcement today that are thinking and acting like these women do.
Yeah, women rock. Of course, we want to acknowledge all members of the evidence response team who worked on Operation United. Women may have been leading this effort, but from the images and photos I've seen that were taken on site at the cemetery and graveyard exhumations, there were lots of men participating and contributing to this effort. So we definitely want to acknowledge them too. And in reference to those images, like the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And you and FBI headquarters have provided nearly 30 photos from Operation United excavations. The photos show the unbelievable commitment of the evidence response team members who do this work, carefully and respectfully digging up human remains so that those victims may receive the justice they deserve. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode that will take you directly to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com so you can witness yourself the hard work of Shannon and Leslie, of the anthropologists, and all of the members of the Detroit Evidence Response Team.
I just love that in this case, the most important thing for Leslie and Shannon wasn't putting convicted murderer in jail. They set out with a goal. You know what their first goal was? They had two primary goals. You know what the first one was?
No.
Identifying the family members, identifying the person and reconnecting them with their family members.
That doesn't sound like a law enforcement goal, usually.
I think that more than anything else, Shannon said over and over again, these are mothers and fathers, daughters, uncles, aunts, siblings, child. These are family members who disappeared, and the people who lost them lost a part of their soul.
I do want to make sure that FBI administrators get credit for this, because they could have told Special Agent Leslie Larson, no. We're not going to allow our manpower to be devoted to this, and we are not going to provide funding. But they did say yes, and they did sign on to help with this project that had nothing to do with FBI violations. Can you talk a little bit about the FBI's commitment to working with law enforcement partners and helping them?
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily know about the FBI is that, when we do cases, as I'm sure you've talked about and your listeners would know, bank robbery is a 91. A bank robbery with somebody who's armed is a 91A. All the cases have categories of all the violations that we work have category numbers. Police cooperation case is a 343G. I might have that wrong, but I think that's what it is. And police cooperation, it's an important part of the FBI's job. And a very important part of the FBI's job is to help local law enforcement, state, local, tribal law enforcement in any way they need it, if they can, if there's something that we can do. So a great example of that is that there were times when the DNA lab that was going to do this testing disappeared. And mind you, this went on for years. And the FBI laboratory said, we'll take some of that. We'll run some of the DNA. That's cooperation. Otherwise, the cases would not have been followed through on. Another example, I work in my other lifetime. I'm a mass killing expert, unfortunately. And a great example of police cooperation is when the Sandy Hook shooting happened at Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, the Aurora Theater, Colorado shooting. Those shootings can overwhelm local and state law enforcement. But why would we only ask a local police department or sheriff's office to go to work those crimes when we have trained law enforcement at the federal and state and local and tribal levels? And that's how the FBI sees its role, is that it's a force multiplier when it's needed in a crisis situation, because time is the most important element in a crisis situation. At Sandy Hook, there were two teams who did what we call clearing the school, meaning going through the school and making sure that there was nothing of danger in the school so that they could start a criminal investigation. And one of the two teams that went through was our SWAT team from up there. They came to the scene, they volunteered and said, we will search. We will be one of the teams that helps to clear the building. And the FBI does that all the time. When the Aurora Theater massacre occurred in Colorado, the FBI came in and said, we could interview all the witnesses. They had 1,000 people, they thought, at the theater. They put them all on buses. They took them to local high schools, and the FBI sent 50, 100, I don't know how many agents who sat in the room, took individuals' names, took their identifying phone numbers and things like that, and said, did you see anything? Is there anything you want us to share? And then, said, thank you very much, and said, we'll contact you. That is a way that we could force multiply. That took all that pressure off of the Aurora, Colorado Police Department to have to interview witnesses. We do the same thing at airplane crashes, bus crashes, train crashes. I had a kidnapping that I worked up in Wisconsin. And when the sheriff's office called, we had an 88-year-old woman who was kidnapped. And when the sheriff's office called, I said, we'll send 50 agents to help. And we sent 50 agents to a sheriff's office in an hour. You can't get that unless you have a recognition that it's an important part of the FBI's job is to support state and local law enforcement.
And that's why it always irritates me when I see in books, TV, and movies, that scene where the FBI is shown to take over a case and basically not play well with others. When in these situations, in these 343G police cooperation cases, we come in and provide support and assistance, and then we leave.
Right.
Many times the public has no idea that the FBI was even there because the case and the investigation belongs to that local agency or state agency, and we let them get their well-deserved credit for solving that case or resolving that crisis.
Let me suggest this too as a prosecutor in the state level. I was a state prosecutor. Every case isn't a federal case. You can't bring a case in federal court. So the FBI's job is to help collect the evidence to support the information that might be needed for a prosecution, whether it's at the state or local level. Because when it comes to charging as a prosecutor, we want to charge a case the best way that we have the evidence that matches the crime. If we think that we have evidence to convict somebody, that might be for a state charge, it might be for a federal charge, or it might be for both. It might be a federal gun charge, and it might be a state murder charge. We want to be able to charge with both. The circumstances where the FBI takes priority on a case are very limited. One of them is when it's a terrorism case. So an intelligence breach. There are very limited numbers of cases where the FBI takes priority.
That's why having podcasts like ours and the other active FBI podcast out there, what we're trying to do is to bring these cases, bring these stories to the public so they have a full understanding of who we are and what we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a podcast called Stop the Killing. As you mentioned, my co-host, Sarah Ferris, lives in London. It's about Second Amendment issues and mass shootings and active shooters and the kind of things that scare us about firearms and deaths involving firearms. And that's my area of expertise. And I try to share with the public, hey, here's where the FBI comes in. Here's where federal offices come in, federal gun laws come in. And here's where the state and locals are the priority.
And your podcast and the others that I mentioned, help to clear that up for the public. Now, getting back to Operation United, one of the primary goals for Shannon and Leslie was to just identify who these people are. And so I want to bring up another episode that I did, and it was episode 318, where I interviewed Lisa Bailey, who was an FBI forensic artist. And she talked about how she used her skills to mold clay and bones and to help identify missing persons. And she worked a lot with that Name Us group that you talked about. So again, anybody interested in expanding what they're learning from this episode should check out episode 318 also.
Great.
Now, did you tell us the second one? Because you said there were two things that Shannon and Leslie, their goals.
You listen and you follow up. I love it.
Yes. Yeah. So what was that? What was the second one?
Let's solve some murders.
Ooh, okay.
So they are solving murders. And in fact, they're doing it, today as we speak. And so I'm taking notes. I think I'm going to have to do a follow-up, right, to the book. But I might try to do it. Anybody who wants to go to my website, which is katherineschweit.com, what I'm going to try to do is when we get information about murders that are solved or resolutions and identifications, I'm going to try to summarize those and send out notes to the people who are interested so that they don't have to, wait for an epilogue to be written in the book. Or maybe I'll just write an epilogue and post it.
Yeah, because I know one of the things when you're reading the book is as investigators, we're thinking, okay, well, this was what you did. What are the results? And because of the nature of this operation, we're not able to talk about results right now as for all of these 200 people. And you mentioned it because it's going to take some time and some resources to, now that they have collected the DNA, to now analyze it. There's just not the funding available just to do all of it at one time. And I think, I don't know if you mentioned, I read it in the book, that even the FBI laboratory is talking about doing, was it 5 a month?
Yeah. Well, the lab, I mean, they have to do DNA work when they can do it, and they have their own priorities too. And so for Leslie and Shannon, their highest priority is how can we get the DNA matching done? Because then we can work on the investigations. But DNA testing takes a long time. It's a long and expensive effort if you do it on your own. If you just did one for one family, it might be $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. So we're asking the laboratories to do this work, and they have to do it and the schedule they can do it in. So we're not going to have DNA testing done on 200 plus bodies in a month. It's just not possible. The resources aren't there. Maybe there's another way to get the resources, but they're not there now.
And as far as Operation United, have they completed their exhumation of these bodies? They're all done with that, right?
Yes, they finished all the exhumations, but one good idea begets another is that shortly after that, the Philadelphia Police Department called and said, "Hey, can you come and do that here?" And Leslie said, "Sure," because she never says no. And other departments across the country, Leslie says, "We created the roadmap to do this." And other departments across the country are now saying, "Here's how we can solve our unsolved murders, our cold case murders, because they're unknowns. We're going to start doing this." And so they're going to start doing it. And other communities are doing it. And Leslie and her team are supporting it in the ways that they can. Shannon is sharing what she knows with other departments who call. It's changing the way police work functions for missing persons across the country in a way that will never go back.
Well, of course, this podcast is called FBI Retired Case File Review, but I would have loved to have had the opportunity to have Special Agent Leslie Larson, who is still active in the FBI today, on this podcast. And we tried, but we weren't able to work everything out in a timely fashion. So you are speaking on Leslie's behalf as her friend and mentor. I want to thank you again for coming on the show to talk about your book, Women Who Talk to the Dead, the true story of 200 forgotten murder victims and the relentless pursuit of justice by an FBI agent and a Detroit police detective.
Well, thank you, Jerry. It was my honor to be here. I'm happy to share this incredible story of these tenacious law enforcement officers. And I know that for me, it's a special book because it tells a story that we all kind of want to hear, which is that law enforcement doesn't give up. And I think as a law enforcement officer, when I was in the FBI, it was very important to me that no one ever, when I was a young person in the academy, one of the instructors said to me, "In your lifetime, you're going to encounter people who have never met an FBI agent, and you are going to be the only FBI agent they ever meet. You are the FBI. Be the FBI."
Wow, that's powerful. Well, I want to take this time because I know that Leslie listens to the show. And I just want to say to her that we are so proud of you and the dedication and commitment that you bring to the job every single day. And I am thrilled that you are getting this opportunity. And I know you probably don't want it, but for the public to recognize your commitment and to applaud you and your efforts.
Thanks, Jerry. Well deserved. And I mean, Leslie, I couldn't be more proud of her.
This could be a recruiting commercial right now to encourage more women to apply for positions as agents and police officers. Because, like in the case of Leslie and Shannon, this innate inner desire to use their empathy to solve crimes is so needed.
I think as FBI agents, you and I know that a lot of times we were the only female in the room, but we also know the impact that had on cases. I took female victims aside, and was able to loosen them up and make them comfortable enough to tell me what was going on in really uncomfortable situations. Women bring something to the table, and in law enforcement, we often don't have enough women. The FBI should reflect, society, and I think the agent workforce is 22% female now. When I was an executive, less than 5% were females in the agent workforce. But, we make up half the population plus, right? So we do need to have more women because they do need to reflect and interact with society to solve crimes, to support each other. And, everybody brings different things to the table, and certainly the females do too.
Perfect. Now, we've had the chance for you to talk to us about Leslie's story, and we're at the point of the episode where I like to learn a little bit about your story. So my standard question is
Oh my.
when when and why did you join the FBI?
I'm not a typical story, and I'm far from Leslie Larson. I had no interest or intent in joining the FBI. I worked as a journalist. I'm a writer in my head. I've always been a writer, and I worked as a journalist when I was young. I went to law school at night, got married, I had a couple of kids, and worked as a prosecutor in Chicago. But I had, at the time, I had grown up, I have some cousins, and one of my cousins was an FBI agent. And he was living in the same town where one of my sisters was. And he said, she should apply. She should apply. And I was thinking about leaving the prosecutor's office. And I was not even vaguely interested in the FBI. But I applied mostly because she would call me every once in a while and say, John says you should apply. John says you should apply. So I applied. No idea, nothing more than what I learned, what I'd hear from my cousin. I knew nothing about really the FBI. So I'm like the worst story for this for people who long to be an FBI agent. And so kind of an imposter syndrome, because I apply in December, the year before I turned 6 months before I turned 37. And for your listeners may know that at 37, you can't be an agent. And so immediately headquarters, I didn't know, fast tracked my application. And within months, I was offered an opportunity to go to the FBI Academy, which I hemmed and hawed about, not realizing how competitive the jobs were, and finally decided to go because I was at that point a single mom with 2 kids. And that was a big decision to leave my job as a prosecutor for an uncertain job with uncertain pay and a job I didn't know what I was going to do and be assigned to a town I didn't know where. But I left to 36, and 2 weeks before my 37th birthday, I reported to Quantico. And so it was kind of a circuitous route to get there. And when I got there, very imposter syndrome. Everybody in the class introduced themselves and their credentials were stellar. And here I was, just a prosecutor from Chicago. And these people were like nuclear scientists and bank managers and incredible jobs, Navy officers. And so I ended up, so there's the how. And the why, I think I spent the first year wondering why, maybe the first 2 years wondering why. But then 9/11 happened, and I was filling in as a terrorism supervisor for Milwaukee for the state of Wisconsin. And I think 9/11 solidified it for me that I had to stay in and I had to do the job.
Wonderful. And I want to just remind everyone that I had you on the show talking about your area of expertise, the FBI's active shooter program, which you were one of the founders. And that's episode 255. I'd love for them to learn more about what you did in the FBI by listening to that episode. But tell us a little bit what you're doing now, other than writing great books.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope they're okay. I do have a few books out. The other one is one of the more recent books is called A Simple Guide to the Second Amendment, because I teach a law school class in Chicago. Although I live in the Washington, D.C. area, I teach in Chicago at DePaul University College of Law, which is where I got my law degree. And I think the Second Amendment and the gun issues are very mistaken. What we think we know, we don't know. So I teach that class and I enjoy that. So I do that. But also, in addition to writing, I primarily consult many times in school crisis communications situations, school crisis situations. And I do a lot of work with companies and schools in prevention strategies. Do they have the right prevention strategies? How can they avoid a disaster like a shooting? Or when they have a shooting, what can they do to recover from it quickly? And how can they help the people who are impacted? So that's primarily what I do in my consulting job, is I consult and get people on the same page about best practices and how we can be better prepared, and we can prevent tragedy, but also be better prepared if tragedy strikes.
Well, Special Agent Leslie Larson is very fortunate to have a friend and mentor like you. So I want to thank you again for coming on the show to share with us her story. I like to give my guests the last word. So what would you like to say?
Oh, I think I'd love to say, especially to your listeners, that Thank you for believing in the FBI. It's a tough job sometimes. So knowing that there are people out there supporting us, it makes a huge difference. When you're away from your families, when you're traveling, when you don't want to, when you miss your kids, school recital. So thank you for supporting us.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find a photo of retired agent Katherine Schweit, along with an official photo of Special Agent Leslie Larson and her bio. There are also links to news articles about Operation United and nearly 30 case-related images. There's also a link to other FBI retired case file review episodes about identifying missing persons and using familial DNA to solve cold cases. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.